April 1945. The war was ending, but no one dared to believe it. In a shattered valley outside Regensburg, smoke drifted from the remains of a field hospital that once bore the Red Cross on its roof. The symbol was half-burned now, blackened by artillery blasts and days of retreat. Inside, the air reeked of disinfectant and fear. Metal trays rattled on tables. A few German nurses, pale, dust-streaked, their uniforms torn and stained, moved silently between the wounded. They had heard the gunfire grow closer with every hour. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. SS convoys had vanished, and rumors spread that the Americans were only a few kilometers away. To these women, capture meant humiliation. They had seen the propaganda, stories of Allied revenge, of women dragged into shame. Some hid their insignias, others clutched small crosses or photographs. Then came the sound of engines. Outside, U.S. jeeps approached through the rubble, and the nurses froze, waiting for the cruelty they were taught to expect. But what awaited them was something they could never have imagined. The camera lingers on their faces, fear turning into disbelief. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing under the weight of its own war. Cities lay in ruins, the Reich in fragments. Allied bombers owned the skies. Trains no longer ran on schedule. Some never arrived at all. Every field hospital was a place of exhaustion and disbelief, caught between duty and the inevitable end. The German Medical Corps, known as the Sanitätsdienst, had long relied on women to fill the ranks of its overextended hospitals. Thousands of trained nurses, from the German Red Cross, Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, the National Socialist People's Welfare, NSV, and even the Wehrmacht auxiliary services, worked in field stations and makeshift medical tents along the front. Most were in their 20s, some barely out of nursing school. They had served through years of unimaginable hardship. From the Eastern Front's frozen field hospitals to the bombed-out wards of Cologne and Hamburg, these women had tended the wounded under collapsing roofs, without anesthesia, without rest, and often under fire. Many had treated enemy prisoners when ordered to. Others had watched their patients die not from wounds, but from cold, infection, or despair. But now, in the spring of 1945, their world was unraveling. As American, British, and Soviet troops advanced, the German command system disintegrated. Orders became meaningless. Nurses found themselves abandoned as combat units retreated or were destroyed. Medical convoys were strafed by Allied aircraft. Hospitals overrun by front lines shifting too fast to follow. Some medical staff were captured by the Red Army, their fate often grim. The stories that trickled back from the east were horrific, spreading fear through every remaining station. By contrast, little was known about the Americans beyond what Nazi propaganda had repeated for years: that they were merciless conquerors, corrupted by greed and vengeance. Posters warned that Allied troops would show no mercy to German women. Even among trained nurses, educated and disciplined, those fears lingered deep. Yet, the Americans who approached southern Germany in April 1945 were not fueled by vengeance. For many, the war had become an exhausting duty rather than a crusade. The men of the U.S. Third Army, under General George S. Patton, had fought their way through France, the Ardennes, and into Bavaria. They had seen the worst of human suffering, and many had no appetite left for cruelty. Still, to the women waiting in those hospitals, none of that was known. They could hear the sounds of American columns approaching. Engines shouted orders, tank tracks grinding over roads once patrolled by the Wehrmacht. Some nurses debated fleeing. Others stayed with their patients, believing that duty, even at the end, demanded it. In many units, the Red Cross flag was still displayed, though many feared it would attract fire rather than mercy. A few officers urged them to hide any association with the German military, to remove rank patches and insignias. Some obeyed, Others, proud of their service, refused. By early April, Allied patrols were encountering increasing numbers of medical staff, nurses, orderlies, and doctors, stranded in bombed-out villages or tending to wounded soldiers left behind. Reports from U.S. intelligence units described scenes of confusion rather than resistance. In many cases, the Americans entered without a shot fired. The U.S. Army Medical Corps had issued clear orders. Medical personnel, regardless of nationality, were to be treated under the Geneva Convention. Female nurses were to be processed separately from male prisoners, protected from harm, and treated with respect. Those directives, drafted in 1943 and refined as the Allies advanced, reflected both humanitarian values and a desire to contrast American conduct against the brutality of the Axis powers. Still, these written orders were one thing, the lived reality another. When American jeeps rolled into a captured German field hospital, the soldiers often faced a haunting sight. Rows of cots filled with men barely alive, nurses too exhausted to speak, the air thick with blood and ether. In such places, the front lines seemed to dissolve. For a brief moment, the war's ideological walls cracked open, replaced by something painfully human, a shared exhaustion, a quiet recognition that both sides had reached their limits. And, for the German nurses, that moment was the beginning of an unexpected awakening, a confrontation not with violence, but with decency. That realization would spread slowly, camp by camp, hospital by hospital, reshaping what they thought they knew about their enemies. Across occupied Germany in April and May 1945, the process of surrender unfolded in fragments, one town at a time, one shattered command post at a time. What had once been a vast, disciplined military machine was now a mosaic of isolated pockets. Hospitals, depots, and remnants of battalions waiting for someone to tell them the war was over. For the Americans, this fragmentation created a new kind of challenge, the handling of hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war. Infantry divisions advancing through Bavaria and Thuringia found themselves suddenly responsible for whole camps of captives, most of them Wehrmacht soldiers who had simply given up. Among these were thousands of women, nurses, clerks, and auxiliary staff who had served with field hospitals or administrative units. The U.S. Army's guidelines for prisoner management were clear. Grounded in the 1929 Geneva Convention, German medical personnel were to be classified as non-combatants and could continue their work under Allied supervision if necessary. But the inclusion of women, particularly those in military uniform, was new territory. American units were unprepared for the psychological and cultural shock of encountering women in surrendering formations. In German propaganda, the Americans had been portrayed as barbaric invaders, men without honor or restraint. This imagery was meant to stiffen resistance, to make civilians and medical staff alike fear capture more than death. Even as the regime fell, those fears lingered. Yet what actually awaited many of these women was something they could hardly comprehend. U.S. military police often arrived with caution rather than aggression. Their first act, in most cases, was to secure weapons and assess the wounded. Many reports from frontline captains describe scenes of stunned silence as German nurses stood with their hands raised, expecting the worst. But instead of violence, they were often offered cigarettes, water, or even medical supplies. The Americans understood they were being watched, not by the enemy, but by their own command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had issued strict instructions on the treatment of German POWs, especially women and civilians. The goal was to maintain discipline and moral authority, to show the difference between a conquering army and a civilized one. To ensure order, the Allies established temporary holding camps, transit enclosures, throughout Germany. Some were near Regensburg, others around Würzburg, Heilbronn, and Nuremberg. Inside these enclosures, captured personnel were sorted by rank, role, and gender. Women were placed in separate quarters, guarded under U.S. military police supervision. They received food rations, basic shelter, and medical attention. In one report from the 12th U.S. Army Group, dated May 1945, officers noted that female German personnel have conducted themselves with discipline and calm. No significant disturbances or acts of resistance have occurred. The tone was almost surprised, as if both captors and captives were uncertain how to behave in such a reversed world. But for the German nurses themselves, this orderliness was almost incomprehensible. They had braced themselves for brutality. Instead, they found courtesy. American soldiers standing aside to let them pass, offering blankets, or helping them tend to the wounded. For many, it was the first time they saw an enemy not as a monster, but as a man capable of restraint. Letters written later by captured nurses reveal this shock. One recalled, "I was sure they would humiliate us. Instead, they brought us food. They called us ma'am. We did not know what to make of it." Another described the confusion when U.S. guards offered soap and cigarettes, luxuries, long vanished from the German front. This behavior was not universal. There were exceptions, confusion, rough handling, or indifference in some places. But the overall pattern remained remarkably consistent. American guards treated German female POWs in a manner that stood in stark contrast to what the propaganda machine had predicted. This unexpected decency spread by word of mouth through every captured hospital and camp. German nurses began to whisper stories that sounded impossible, that the Americans did not harm them, that they followed rules, that they treated even the wounded Germans with care. These whispers became a quiet undercurrent of disbelief running through the ruins of the Reich. For the Americans, the presence of these nurses posed another realization. The enemy was not a faceless uniform anymore. These were young women who had spent years under the same horrors of war. They had been taught to hate, and now stood before men who chose not to answer hate with hate. That silent exchange of fear met by decency was one of the war's smallest, yet most profound turning points. It was in these moments, among the ruins of hospitals and the dust of surrender, that the myth of barbaric conquerors began to dissolve. And from that fragile beginning emerged the human stories that history would nearly forget. The moments when compassion outlasted ideology. For the German nurses, fear was immediate and instinctive. Years of training, years of discipline, had not prepared them for the sudden collapse of their world. They had treated soldiers who suffered horrific injuries, worked in freezing trenches, and endured nights of bombings. Yet the thought of surrender to the Americans was more terrifying than any wound. They had been told to expect cruelty, humiliation, and violence. Each rumble of an approaching jeep, each shout of a foreign language made their hearts race. Some nurses clutched personal mementos, letters from home, religious symbols, small photographs of family members, as if these objects could shield them from what they imagined awaited. When the Americans entered the hospitals, there was a pause, an almost cinematic stillness. The nurses froze mid-step, eyes wide. Hands trembled as they moved to protect the wounded, uncertain whether they should obey, hide, or flee. And then came the first moments of disbelief. Food offered, blankets handed over, calm instructions in clear English. It was almost impossible to trust what they were seeing. For some, it took days before fear subsided. They questioned their assumptions. Could the enemy truly act with honor? Yet, in the mundane gestures, distributing water, helping carry stretchers, gently tending the wounded, they began to recognize a new reality. This human reaction, fear transforming slowly into cautious trust, became the foundation of their story. It was not dramatic in the traditional sense. No guns were fired, no heroic charges were made. The drama was in the psychology, in the fragile awakening that decency could exist amid devastation. From the American perspective, The treatment of German nurses was a test of military discipline and moral authority. Soldiers were trained not only to fight, but to uphold the Geneva Convention. Officers reminded their men that actions now would be recorded, remembered, and compared against the enemy. In field reports, many U.S. units noted the unusual circumstances: female captives, often young and frightened, with medical uniforms and badges that could be mistaken for combatant status. These soldiers were confronted with a unique challenge, a moment where humanity had to be deliberate, conscious, and enforced. Discipline was strict. Guards followed specific protocols, segregating male and female POWs, offering food, water, and medical attention, and providing basic comforts like blankets and hygiene products. Orders were explicit. No harassment, no physical intimidation. Maintain professionalism at all times. In practice, this moral framework succeeded more often than not. Accounts from both soldiers and prisoners describe moments of quiet civility. An American sergeant holding the door open for a nurse, medics assisting with wounded patients, officers issuing polite instructions in English or broken German. The contrast to Nazi propaganda was stark. German nurses had been trained to believe that enemy soldiers were barbaric, lawless, and cruel. The reality, however, illustrated a profound moral difference. The Allied forces acted not out of fear or revenge, but principle. These small acts of discipline and respect became enduring symbols of ethical conduct in wartime. The impact on the nurses went beyond fear and physical relief. It shook the very foundations of what they had been taught to believe. For years, the Reich had instilled a narrative of hatred and suspicion. Enemy soldiers were inhuman, devoid of honor, and deserving of contempt. Yet, standing in the debris of shattered hospitals, confronted with Americans offering care and basic kindness, this narrative began to crumble. The nurses' psychology shifted from conditioned fear to cautious observation. They watched, analyzed, and slowly recalibrated their expectations. Some wrote later about the dissonance. The Americans treated them as professionals, acknowledged their medical role, and preserved their dignity. The realization was profound. An entire worldview challenged not by rhetoric, but by lived experience. This psychological collapse was subtle but transformative. It created a space for empathy and reflection, allowing the nurses to see past the uniform and recognize shared humanity. The process was not immediate. Suspicion lingered. Doubts persisted. But over hours and days, the nurses began to reconcile fear with the evidence before them. That respect and honor could survive even in the midst of total war. This mental shift was as significant as any battlefield victory. It reframed the meaning of surrender and introduced a quiet, yet revolutionary, moral clarity. The nurses' professionalism did not vanish with the approach of the Americans. Even as the world around them crumbled, they continued to tend to the wounded. Some Wehrmacht soldiers, others civilians caught in the crossfire. Field hospitals were makeshift, often in barns, school buildings, or bombed-out clinics. Electricity was sporadic. Water scarce, supplies dwindling. When U.S. troops arrived, they were struck by the organization amid chaos. Cots were arranged with care, records maintained despite paper shortages, and triage followed the principles learned years earlier. Nurses moved with precision, tending to gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and infections. The Americans quickly realized that these women were highly skilled. Medics and surgeons collaborated with them when possible, sharing tools, rationing medicine, and even respecting their hierarchy. This cooperation was unusual. In most combat zones, fear and suspicion would dominate. Here, professionalism created a bridge between former enemies. Even small gestures mattered. An American orderly handing a nurse a fresh bandage, a medic guiding her through unfamiliar equipment, or shared language over surgical procedures. These moments of technical collaboration became subtle acts of trust, reinforcing the human and moral angles already in play. the capture of female personnel challenged both German and American assumptions. Historically, prisoners of war had been overwhelmingly male. Women, particularly in military uniforms, were a new variable. Many American soldiers had never interacted with enemy women outside propaganda narratives, and German nurses had been trained to fear not only death, but sexual violence and humiliation. The U.S. military responded by creating protocols specifically for women. They were segregated, housed separately, and given privacy wherever possible. Officers emphasized respect, not only as a legal requirement, but as a demonstration of American discipline. For the nurses, this treatment was astonishing. Accounts detail the disbelief at simple gestures, beds made for them, separate latrines, clean clothing, and polite instructions. Some described being offered work within the camp, assisting with other wounded prisoners, without fear of punishment or exploitation. This gendered perspective highlights a broader point. The presence of women forced a reconsideration of power dynamics. Civility could be exercised without diminishing authority. Authority and compassion were not mutually exclusive. For the German nurses, this realization reshaped their understanding of the enemy and the nature of surrender. On a larger scale, these encounters reflected a turning point in military conduct. The collapse of the Third Reich coincided with the Allies' opportunity to demonstrate that war need not erase humanity. The treatment of German nurses became a microcosm of a broader strategy, winning not just the battlefield, but the moral high ground. Reports from the 12th U.S. Army Group and other units document the consistent application of Geneva Convention principles. Captured women were offered medical care, food, and shelter. Those who had feared humiliation found themselves treated with dignity. Historians have noted that such behavior had consequences beyond the immediate moment. It softened resentment among POWs, reduced the likelihood of unrest, and left a record of ethical conduct that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the German regime. Memoirs written decades later highlight how these experiences influenced post-war reconciliation, both individually and nationally. Through these 6 angles, human, moral, psychological, medical, gender, and historical, the story of German nurses captured by U.S. forces reveals a deeper truth. Even amid total war, human decency could survive. These moments did not change the course of the conflict, but they shaped the narrative of what it meant to be human in the midst of destruction. And it is from this convergence of fear, professionalism, morality, and historical circumstance that the decisive moment, the climax, begins to emerge, where expectation meets reality, and the nurses' disbelief transforms into recognition of their humanity preserved. April 1945. The field hospital outside Regensburg was quiet, but the silence was tense. Dust hung in the air like fog, stirred only by the occasional gust through broken windows. The nurses moved among the cots, checking on soldiers who were barely alive, their bodies marked by shrapnel, gunshot wounds, and infection. Every sound outside, the low rumble of engines, the occasional barked order in a foreign language, made them flinch. At 10:30 a.m., the first jeeps appeared on the rubble-strewn road. American troops, advancing cautiously, slowed their vehicles, scanning the hospital ruins. The German nurses froze mid-step, expecting violence, expecting the mockery and contempt that propaganda had promised. Their hands trembled. One nurse held tightly to a stretcher, as if sheer will could protect her from the horrors to come. The lead U.S. officer, a captain in the 3rd Infantry Division, ordered his men to halt. The protocol was clear: identify, disarm, and secure. But the soldiers' discipline extended beyond procedure. It included restraint, respect, and empathy. An American medic stepped forward, motioning the nurses to remain calm. His English was slow, deliberate. "We are here to help. No harm will come to you. Follow instructions." The words, simple yet foreign, felt almost surreal. The nurses exchanged uncertain glances. Could the enemy truly speak with such calm? Could this be real? For minutes, the tension stretched. Every creak of broken wood, every whisper from the wounded, amplified the fear. And then, small, deliberate acts began to bridge the gap between expectation and reality. One American soldier handed a nurse a blanket. Another offered water. An orderly assisted an elderly nurse in reaching a cot. No jeers, no demands, no humiliation. Just quiet, measured human decency. The nurses began to respond in kind. Fear still lingered, but disbelief started to take hold. They helped carry stretchers, organized supplies, and coordinated with the Americans to continue tending to the wounded. Slowly, carefully, a fragile trust emerged. Witness reports describe the scene in almost cinematic detail. The nurse's hands, once trembling with dread, began to steady. Eyes that had anticipated rage now scanned for guidance. The wounded looked on, some too weak to comprehend the shift, yet sensing a strange calm. Outside, other units of the U.S. Third Army moved into position, securing the surrounding area. German soldiers who had been hiding in nearby ruins came out cautiously, surrendering without resistance. The Americans maintained discipline, processing prisoners efficiently, while ensuring the nurses were kept separate, respected, and protected. Among the nurses, the psychological impact was immediate. One wrote later, "I could not believe my eyes. The men spoke kindly, treated us like professionals. It was as if the world had reversed. We expected monsters. We found humans." Another described the surreal calm. "I had braced for insult, for cruelty. There was none. Only order, only care." The moment reached its climax when the Americans allowed the nurses to assist in triage alongside their medics. For the first time, the enemy became a collaborator. Bandages, saline, stretchers, tools of survival, not war, were shared. A wounded soldier moaned, and an American medic and German nurse worked side by side, performing a procedure that would have seemed impossible just hours before. The significance was not in heroics or combat, but in the collision of expectation and reality. The nurses had been trained to fear, indoctrinated to despise, and prepared for the worst. Yet the Americans' measured, respectful behavior shattered that conditioning. The climax was psychological, moral, and human. A quiet revolution in the rubble of total war. As the morning faded into afternoon, the nurses began to move more freely, guided by trust rather than fear. The Americans maintained a calm authority, reinforcing that safety, dignity, and respect were non-negotiable. By the end of the day, the nurses could almost breathe again, the weight of imminent danger lifting. And in that fragile calm, the foundation for lasting reflection was laid. What began as terror transformed into understanding. What had been trained fear became recognition of shared humanity. From this moment, the story of German nurses captured by U.S. forces would ripple outward, influencing other camps, other hospitals, and other interactions. Their disbelief was no longer a passive reaction. It became an active process of learning, observing, and ultimately accepting the unexpected reality that even in war, decency could survive. By mid-afternoon, the field hospital had transformed into a scene of cautious cooperation. The initial tension had eased, replaced by a fragile rhythm. German nurses moved among cots with purpose, American medics shadowing their steps, offering tools, blankets, and guidance when needed. The wounded, some delirious from fever, looked on, sensing the absence of hostility. A defining moment came when an American officer allowed a small group of nurses to assist in triaging a batch of newly arrived casualties. For the nurses, this was both terrifying and affirming. They were now working side by side with the soldiers they had been trained to fear. Hands once trembling now guided stretchers with precision. Voices once stiff with caution now coordinated procedures. One nurse later wrote, "For the first time in months, I felt like a human again, not a prisoner, not a soldier's accessory. We were allowed to do what we knew best, care for the wounded. And they let us. This moment crystallized the core of the experience. Respect was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and disciplined. Outside the hospital, the surrounding area began to echo with the patterns of organized surrender. Small groups of Wehrmacht soldiers emerged from hiding, surrendering their weapons under strict orders. The Americans processed them efficiently, maintaining order and minimizing chaos. Yet the presence of female medical personnel introduced a new dynamic, one of moral responsibility. Guards were reminded constantly, no harassment, no intimidation, uphold the Geneva Convention. Within the hospital, gestures that might have seemed trivial elsewhere became profound symbols. A nurse offered a bandage and an American medic accepted it with a nod. Water bottles were passed hand to hand. Blankets were folded and handed over politely. Each act reinforced the realization that the enemy was acting according to principle, not impulse. The psychological impact on the nurses deepened as hours passed. Suspicion gradually gave way to cautious trust. Conversations emerged: broken German, slow English, questions about the wounded, instructions on procedures, small acknowledgments of competence. One American sergeant reportedly remarked, "They know their work. Let them help. We're all trying to save lives here." That simple acknowledgement carried more weight than any military order. It validated the nurses' expertise and restored their sense of dignity. This was the turning point, a convergence of expectation and reality, fear and trust, indoctrination and evidence. The nurses had been trained to anticipate cruelty. Instead, they were treated with humanity. Their worldview, shaped by years of propaganda and hardship, shifted in real time. It was a quiet revolution, invisible to those outside the hospital, yet deeply transformative for those within. The afternoon progressed with a rhythm of controlled calm. The Americans maintained security, ensuring no accidental harm came to either staff or patients. Nurses administered care as they had for months, now without the shadow of imminent violence. Orders were given respectfully, questions answered patiently. For the first time in the chaos of the collapsing Reich, the nurses felt the world make sense in small, measurable ways. By evening, the moment had passed, yet its significance lingered. The nurses understood that their treatment was not an anomaly. The Americans had acted consistently, deliberately, and morally, offering a model of conduct starkly contrasting with the war they had endured. Disbelief gave way to reflection, and reflection planted the seeds of enduring memory. This turning point extended beyond the hospital walls. Stories of respectful treatment spread to nearby camps, reaching other medical personnel and prisoners. Each account reinforced a simple truth. Even in a war defined by violence, moments of decency could endure. And so, the stage was set for what came next, the aftermath. How these experiences shaped the processing of female POWs, how nurses recorded and remembered these moments, and how the Allies' disciplined conduct influenced post-war reconciliation. From fear to disbelief, and then to recognition of humanity, the climax had arrived. The nurses' expectations had been shattered in the quietest, most profound of ways, setting the stage for both immediate and long-term consequences. The days following the surrender were filled with procedural order, yet the atmosphere remained fragile. The German nurses, now formally recognized as prisoners of war, were escorted from the field hospital to a temporary holding facility near Regensburg. The Americans ensured that women were housed separately from male soldiers, in accordance with military regulations and the Geneva Convention. For many nurses, the transition was disorienting, from constant fear to unexpected safety, from anticipation of humiliation to quiet dignity. Inside the transit facility, the routine of POW life began to take shape. Beds were arranged in neat rows, blankets folded with care, and hygiene routines maintained with an attention the nurses had not expected from enemy soldiers. Meals were modest but consistent: bread, soup, and occasionally fruit. The simple act of being fed and sheltered, of having one's basic needs met, struck many as almost miraculous after years of scarcity. American guards maintained strict discipline. While they remained vigilant for potential unrest, their interactions with female POWs were deliberate, courteous, and professional. Medical personnel were allowed to continue caring for the wounded under supervision, creating a continuity of purpose. The nurses' skills, rather than being sidelined, were valued and incorporated into the camp's functioning. In reports filed by U.S. Army units, officers noted the unusual calm among the female POWs. One memorandum from May 1945 stated, "The German nurses exhibit no resistance or insubordination. They conduct themselves with composure and professionalism. Their cooperation with our medical staff has been exemplary." Such remarks underscore the contrast between expectation and reality. The Americans anticipated potential defiance or panic, yet found instead order and collaboration. Letters and memoirs written by nurses during or after their captivity reveal a recurring theme of disbelief. One nurse described walking through the camp, noting that guards treated them with a politeness I never thought possible. "We were expected to follow rules, yes, but never demeaned, never mocked." Another reflected on the paradox of surrender. "We had feared the Americans more than death itself, yet they were the first to treat us with genuine respect in months." The psychological shift began to solidify. The initial shock, the disbelief at humane treatment, gradually transformed into a cautious acceptance. The nurses, once bracing for abuse, now found themselves navigating an environment where obedience was met with fairness, skill recognized rather than disregarded, and personal dignity preserved. This was not immediate comfort. The nurses remained wary, aware that the world outside was still unstable. Yet, the contrast to their prior expectations was stark. Even within the camp, small acts reinforced this new understanding. A guard would open a door for a nurse carrying a tray of medicine. Medics shared scarce supplies without hesitation. Officers engaged in brief conversation, sometimes in broken German, sometimes in gestures, demonstrating the intentionality behind their conduct. These actions were minor in the larger theater of war, yet monumental for those who had long endured cruelty and indoctrination. The narrative extended beyond the immediate confines of the camp. Word spread from hospital to hospital, from one unit to the next, that German female medical personnel were being treated according to international law. This news traveled through whispered conversations, notes passed between prisoners, and eventually letters sent home or recorded in diaries. Each account added to a slowly growing perception. The Americans' disciplined behavior was not isolated, but consistent across multiple locations. The implications were both practical and moral. Practically, the calm conduct of guards reduced the risk of unrest, ensured efficient processing, and allowed the nurses to continue performing essential medical work. Morally, these encounters created a quiet but profound counter-narrative to years of Nazi propaganda. The enemy, feared, vilified, and demonized, was now understood to be capable of restraint, fairness, and humanity. In the aftermath of the surrender, the German nurses began to reconcile the trauma of war with this new reality. They continued to perform their duties, now in a structured and relatively safe environment, while processing the emotional impact of what had occurred. Fear was replaced by cautious trust. Disbelief gave way to reflection. The events of that April morning in Regensburg and the subsequent days of careful, respectful interaction became a reference point, a memory of humanity persisting amid devastation. This phase set the stage for the next chapter: the longer-term consequences, the lasting impressions on the nurses, and the broader historical significance of their treatment by U.S. forces. As the weeks passed, the German nurses' lives in captivity settled into a routine, Yet the memory of those first interactions with American forces continued to shape their perspective. The U.S. military, adhering to its strict protocols, ensured that the women were moved gradually from temporary holding areas to larger POW camps further west, still under careful supervision. Each transfer emphasized order, safety, and respect, a repetition of the lessons first learned at the field hospital. In these larger camps, nurses were allowed to continue their work with wounded or ill prisoners, both German and Allied. Their skills were valued, and their authority respected. This collaboration, working across enemy lines within the controlled environment of captivity, reinforced a central truth: professional competence, human dignity, and moral conduct could coexist even amid the aftermath of total war. Letters, diaries, and post-war memoirs provide vivid accounts of this period. One nurse described the disbelief she felt when guards ensured she had adequate clothing, clean bedding, and the opportunity to wash properly. Small courtesies that had become extraordinary against the backdrop of years of deprivation. Another recalled being allowed to walk in camp courtyards unaccompanied, an independence she had long thought impossible for a prisoner of war. The American officers and medics often engaged with the nurses on a professional level, discussing treatment methods, sharing resources, and occasionally offering guidance on new medical procedures. For the nurses, this was a revelation. Their training, once conducted under fear and scarcity, was now acknowledged and respected by former enemies. It was a stark contrast to what they had been led to expect from Allied forces and underscored the deliberate, moral discipline enforced by U.S. military leadership. These experiences also had a broader psychological impact. The nurses' initial fear and suspicion gradually evolved into cautious trust and, in some cases, admiration. The American troops' consistency and adherence to rules became a living example that not all wartime behavior was dictated by brutality. For many nurses, the recognition of this order and civility provided a framework for coping with the collapse of their world and the uncertainty of post-war life. Historians and post-war commentators have noted that such treatment contributed to long-term reconciliation. The nurses' accounts, collected in letters and later interviews, reveal that these interactions shaped their views of the Americans well into peacetime. Unlike the rigid indoctrination of the Nazi regime, these experiences offered a more nuanced understanding of human nature and the capacity for ethical conduct even in conflict. At the same time, the camps remained a reminder of the broader consequences of defeat. German soldiers and civilians were everywhere, processing the end of the Reich in their own ways. Yet within this broader chaos, the treatment of female medical personnel stood out as a symbol of order, restraint, and humanity. Their stories became reference points, cited in reports and memoirs, for how discipline and morality could be maintained even in the aftermath of widespread destruction. The nurses' reflections reveal another key aspect: the dissonance between expectation and reality. Propaganda had prepared them for humiliation, but the lived experience offered something entirely different. Respect and protection, small gestures of kindness, and recognition of their professional expertise challenged deeply ingrained beliefs. This dissonance was more than a personal revelation. It was a quiet yet powerful demonstration of the values the Allies sought to uphold as they closed the European theater of war. By the time the war officially ended in May 1945, the German nurses had become witnesses to a form of victory that transcended battlefield outcomes. It was a victory of moral discipline, of humanity preserved, and of dignity maintained even in the most chaotic circumstances. These experiences would later inform post-war accounts, memoirs, and historical research, highlighting how moments of ethical conduct during war can resonate far beyond the immediate event. The aftermath, therefore, was not just about survival. It was about transformation, a recalibration of fear, a validation of professional skill, and an enduring awareness of the moral choices made by individuals even in wartime. And it is from this aftermath that the final reflection emerges, offering perspective on what these encounters meant for history, human behavior, and the enduring possibility of decency amid destruction. In the ruins of April 1945, amid shattered hospitals and fractured lives, a quiet truth emerged. War does not have to erase humanity. The German nurses, trained to fear, indoctrinated to despise, and bracing for cruelty, discovered instead the capacity for decency in their captors. Their disbelief was not naive. It was earned through years of hardship, discipline, and survival under a regime that had normalized brutality. And yet, the Americans' careful adherence to principle, to protocol, and to moral conduct offered a stark contrast that would resonate far beyond that single field hospital. The story of these nurses is not one of grand battles or heroic charges. It is a human story, intimate and understated, showing that acts of respect and professionalism can carry profound weight even in the midst of total war. A blanket handed over, a word spoken politely, a wounded soldier treated with dignity. These small gestures became symbols of moral endurance. They reminded the nurses and history that even when civilization collapses around us, humanity can persist. This encounter also illustrates the broader lessons of wartime conduct. Discipline and empathy are not mutually exclusive. Authority can coexist with respect. Fear can transform into trust when actions consistently reflect principle rather than impulse. The treatment of German nurses by U.S. forces offers a historical blueprint for ethical behavior in conflict, demonstrating that adherence to law and morality can leave a lasting impact on both those who give it and those who receive it. For the nurses, the experience reshaped their understanding of the enemy and, ultimately, of themselves. They carried these lessons forward into post-war life, into memoirs and testimonies that preserved the subtle power of decency amid devastation. And for the observer, it is a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, moments of courage are not always measured in bullets or bombs. Sometimes, they are measured in the respect we extend to one another. In the end, the story of German nurses and U.S. captors is not only a historical footnote. It is a meditation on morality, humanity, and the enduring possibility of civility. A quiet yet profound legacy born from the ashes of war.